Our next group of speakers, and I would ask you to come up and take your place, are Peter Tabuns, who is the NDP M.P.P for the area, and Lee Koo, who is the Liberal candidate. I have to say, ACO is a charity, so we approached all of the political parties, and the Conservative candidate initially agreed to be with us, and then turned around and canceled. And when we approached the Conservative Party, they were unwilling to send a representative. So we have 2, not 3 parties represented here today, which I have many regrets about. But I'm sure we'll have a great conversation. So Peter and Lee,
Hi, I'm Alex Bozikovic. I write about architecture for the Globe and Mail, and I will mostly be sitting up here and listening to Lee and Peter, first of all, and then putting some questions to them on these issues, and I hope we can have a bit of an exchange, finishing with some questions from the audience. Before we get into it, I just want to thank Krista in particular for her perspective. This is a really complex set of issues, as I've found in trying to write about them, and trying to understand how to move forward productively is a challenge. And even how to frame the issue correctly so people understand what is actually going on is a real challenge. So I hope we can do some work today in doing that, and in bringing together the linked issues of student experience and architectural preservation. So how are we going to do that? Lee, if I could ask you to go first, do you mind? Stagecraft. So Lee's going to go first, followed by Peter, just with some opening remarks to address these issues in a broad way, and then we'll get into some questions. So, Lee.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Alex. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to this. It's such an honor and privilege to share the stage with everyone here. I wanted to start off by saying that both of these topics about protecting our heritage and funding our schools are personally very important to me. And I want to tell you why by sharing a personal story. My spouse, who's a teacher, in terms of trying to prepare going into class, went in on a weekend to prep her class for Monday, for the start of school. And so as a good partner, I also accompanied her and went in there. And when we went and opened up the doors to our 3rd floor classroom, there was rain streaming down into the middle of the room, into one of these gray wastebaskets that you see. And it was really terrifying because I have a 3.5-year-old daughter, and when I imagine my daughter having to live in a condition like that, or even my wife to teach in a condition like that, that's just not something that is acceptable. And so no one should have to live, go or teach under such conditions. So today's conversation is about funding. Funding for our schools and protecting our heritage. As a museum educator at the Smithsonian and as a teacher at George Brown, I value knowledge, history, and culture. That's what my degrees are in. And so I believe that the protection of buildings of merit because they teach us about our past and ourselves. Funding and protecting heritage buildings is complicated. We rely on experts to advise us on what buildings should be designated as heritage sites. And those experts need each and every one of us in this room to help advocate for their protection and funding. And we've had great leaders here, and I want to thank Krista for all of her work, because that's what we need, and that call to action is so important. So thank you, Krista. As a province, I think we've been good actors here. We look after and maintain our heritage properties and keep them in a state of good repair. We've empowered local municipalities to designate heritage sites in their communities through the Heritage Act. The other element of funding relates to the state of repair of our schools. This funding question has two parts. The first is funding for maintenance and renewal. The Liberal government has altered the funding formula. It's actually changed it by increasing the funding. The Auditor General said we need $1.4 billion annually. So what do? We allocated $1.4 billion annually. We did it last year, and we did it this year too. We committed $16 billion for the next 10 years, so that there's stability in funding there. This is amazing because we know that students and teachers are at their best when their environment is healthy and safe. Second, when it comes to deferred maintenance, it's tough. It's a huge problem. It's too big to deal with easily, and it's too important to ignore. This government has recognized the scope of the issue and is taking steps to address it. More is being spent on maintenance and renewal than ever before. As a member of government and as a parent, as an educator, continued progress is a priority for me. So to sum this up, we need creative thinking. And we need creative thinking around funding solutions. We know they exist, and we need to be open to have these conversations. So that's why I'm really excited to join this panel. And when I received this invitation, it was really exciting to be a part of it. And as a community, we've come a long way, but we know we need to do more. So this symposium is very important. I'm glad that we're having it. Thank you so much to all of the organizers and funders, because I know it's going to be a great one. So thank you.
Thanks, Lee. And Peter, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the ACO for inviting me, and I want to thank Krista for making the presentation. I had the opportunity to meet Krista back when I was the education critic for the NDP a number of years ago. I think we had a forum in Parkdale about the state of schools there. I think that was 2013. Actually, it may have been before Fix Our Schools actually had the full name that it has now. I have to tell you that in this community, I was the city councillor back in the 1990s. And I left politics in '97 for a number of years. When I came back in 2006, I decided to go into schools to hold public meetings as I had when I was the city councillor, and I was shocked at the state of those schools. I couldn't believe the deterioration that I saw in 9 years. It was a very, very different universe that I came back to. I have to say to all of you that it was clear to us back in the 90s that the funding formula was inadequate, and as people are well aware, the funding formula was set up by the Tories in order to reshape Ontario's finances to ensure money was there to provide a tax cut. It had nothing to do with making schools run well, it had nothing to do with education, it had everything to do with making sure that they could cut taxes as a way of holding together their base. I have to tell you as well that in my years as the education critic for the NDP, and I'm not currently the education critic, I had very sharp arguments with Laurel Broughton, who was the Minister of Education, and with Liz Sandals, who was the Minister of Education, about the funding formula. And I was told repeatedly that they had altered the funding formula and everything was fine now, and that I should stop worrying. I think you have seen from this morning's presentation, the funding formula was not fixed. It has resulted in a backlog of repairs at $16 billion, building on the heritage from the Conservatives of $5 billion in backlog. So if that's fixing the funding formula, I have to tell you it was fixed in the wrong direction. It was fixed very much in the wrong direction. I have to say that I don't believe that this government is going to fix the funding formula. They don't believe it needs anything further. They've done it. They're well aware of the state of the schools. They're facing a very tough election. And they're very happy to say that finally they've come to realize that the last 15 years they've made a mistake. They've run up billions of dollars in costs for schools that are now irrecoverable. About $4 billion worth of buildings were allowed to deteriorate to the point where they have to be replaced. They have been completely irresponsible when it comes to maintaining our stock. I want to say as well that I've worked with the ACO in the past when I was the culture critic, working on preservation of the Lister block and a number of other properties in Ontario and trying to preserve the skyline behind the Ontario legislature. These were always extremely tough battles to deal with this provincial government on. I don't think it needs to be that way. I don't think it should be that way. If we, in the public sector, can't preserve heritage that we own, how on earth are we ever going to preserve heritage that we don't own? So we have a responsibility, and we also have the power, the authority, and the resources to preserve our heritage, and at the same time, to ensure that we have schools that we can be proud of, that operate efficiently because they aren't constantly being damaged from lack of repairs that would keep them in good shape. And I think that's the debate we have to have. How do we ensure that this actually goes forward? I know it won't surprise anyone. It's a partisan thing to say. I don't have confidence that this government will actually repair what they've damaged. And to say now that they're going to fix everything that they've broken for the last 15 years does not strike me as credible. Thank you.
Thank you both. So we may not come to a consensus on exactly the state of affairs.
We may not. It may elude us.
I think not many of us in this room would say that we are satisfied being included with the state of school buildings or with the current government's approach to heritage. Not to put the blame entirely on the current provincial government, but you have been in office, the Liberals have been for 15 years. So, Leah, let's start with you. Practically speaking, how can this situation be improved? And particularly, you mentioned that we need creativity in funding solutions. What might that look like? How could we move forward with different approaches to facilities that would remedy some of the problems we've been talking about? And then, Peter, if you have suggestions, we'll follow with this. Lee?
Okay, thank you so much. So, we know that when Kathleen Wynne, who started off her career as a school board trustee, was a very, well-renowned and respected Minister of Education, when she, within a year of becoming leader, she did increase funding to $1.4 billion a year. So, under that direction, our leader has actually indicated that that's very important. Now, Peter, I agree with you, we need to do more. And I think we share that common ground. My question is, in 2014 in the budget, Andrea Horvath, your leader, allocated $60 million to fix our schools. So if we look at that in black and white, we have actually implemented $1.4 billion. And even now, with the release of the 5-point plan, there's no mention of fixing our schools. So what is your leader going to commit to it?
Well, I appreciate the fact that you're asking a question, Lee. You may want to finish your question. Answering your question, I'm happy to respond to the moderator, and I will address the issues you've raised.
Sure. So I think that, we have had that demonstration that we are investing money in it, and we've been doing that since 2015. And that's a value that I share with Kathleen, the Premier. And I think that in terms of thinking about creative solutions, I'm not the expert of all of the different solutions, but one thing that when I ran a school board trustee, I was thinking about and talking, and in my conversations with other experts, is looking at how do we amend the EDC regulation? Because I think that's a place that we can look at in terms of funding to make it more relevant to the city of Toronto. In Toronto, we have been more relevant. And so if we think about all the money that is being allocated and really help schools that are outside of Toronto where they can purchase land, we need to think about how we can use that locally.
So would that mean potentially changing the ownership model, figuring out how to partner up with the city or with other public institutions or bodies to share ownership or to share use of these facilities in ways that hasn't been done?
I'm certainly open to that, yeah. I think partnership, the greatest success that we have seen in a lot of the models when we think about, creative placemaking spaces has come through the result of different partnerships. So that's something that we need to be open to. We have to try something that hasn't been done, clearly.
Peter, what should we be doing?
I think there are a few things that I want to address. First of all, education development charges should be modified so that schools can access those funds for repairs and for extensions on existing schools. This is something that we've been advocating in the legislature, and I haven't seen any response positively on the part of the government. It certainly doesn't show up in their budget, hasn't shown up in any legislative initiatives. So I think education development charges make sense, but as everyone in this room is aware, they would not be adequate to actually deal with the shortfall. I think the calculation done by Hugh McKenzie was it wasn't Hugh McKenzie, it was TDSB. They generated about $350 million over 15 years. Useful money, wouldn't say no. That's one thing that has to happen, but I think the other thing that has to happen is you have to change the tax structure in Ontario. And the wealthiest corporations and the wealthiest individuals are going to have to pay more if we're actually going to finance the things that we need as a society. We also have to stop doing things like selling off or privatizing assets that generate money for us. The sell-off of Hydro One is going to reduce the amount of money that Ontario has available for hospitals and schools. The Financial Accountability Officer went through that in some detail. The moving of wine and beer sales out of LCBOs means less revenue from the LCBO. The ongoing movements to privatize public assets are going to mean problems for us as a society. So dealing with the tax structure, ending the privatizations, retaining money-generating activities so that we have the funds to do what we need to do, those are the directions we have to go in. But I want to add, the funding formula needs to be changed not just because it needs to be set up so that it recognizes the maintenance and preservation costs for our physical assets, our schools across this province. But it also needs to be changed because, as people are probably well aware right now, the operations of the schools are underfunded so that school boards are constantly under pressure to move funds that would otherwise go to maintenance into operations. And I'm not saying TDSB has done that, but I would say that we see consistently a difficulty in funding areas that should be funded because the central operations are underfunded. And if you continue to do that, you're always going to have temptation on the part of boards or administrators to cut the funding for the school's cut the funding for the school's maintenance and capital needs and move those into other operations.
Let me pose you a specific case study. It is around the TDSB's property at Bloor-Dufferin, where the TDSB has had a presence for, or the old Toronto Board of Education has had a presence for more than a century, and where 7 acres of public land is now being sold off in the middle of Toronto. The problem, the reason that the board has had to do that, has to do with the funding formula. It has to do with the fact that there are too many schools and too much building space in that area for the enrollment that they have. This is a city that's projected to add 500,000 people in the next 25 years. That school is located a few kilometers from the very center of that city, and yet we're offloading public assets and potentially losing 2 school buildings, one of which is 110 years old, the other one of which is almost 100 years old. In terms of public assets and in terms of heritage, that to me does not make a lot of sense. What specifically could be done to allow for those assets to remain in public hands, or for those buildings to be preserved, or both? What would you do?
Is that open to others?
Either of you.
Well, I think it goes back to the question of the funding formula. If you don't have adequate funding, then school boards are going to do what they need to do or feel they need to do to recover cash. And I also have to say to you that I listen to the ministers of education as I go through them. I listen to them in question period. I listen to them when they talk to the media. And they're constantly talking about the need for school boards to sell off buildings, sell off schools, in order to deal with their operational costs. I don't think I have to tell you, but I'd like to say it for the record. There are demographic waves And you can see it in East York in this riding, where we had a population after the Second World War of young families, went through lots of kids, people aged, kids moved out. We had a long-term period when there were very few children, and now we're having a baby boom in the north end of this world. Franklin School at Logan and Danforth, for a period a few decades ago, was looking at being closed and sold off because there weren't enough kids. Parents mobilized around that, kept the building. We went through a period when the playground was full of portables because there were so many kids. Number of portables has gone down. When you sell off those public assets, you cannot recover them. You cannot recover them. And so we need an approach to preservation of those buildings. In situations where you may have temporarily a demographic wave going out where you don't have enough children, then utilize the building space for other public services. Daycare strikes me as a really good one, but there may be other functions that would be usefully housed. However, pushing school boards to sell off their properties, something that this government has done consistently and rigorously, is counterproductive and makes it very difficult for us to preserve public education in the future.
Lee, would you like to respond and to maybe talk about some particular ways in which that type of site might be retained?
So I share a lot of the same same positions as what Peter has just said. I mean, as I stated, my background is in art history. My background is in education. And so I believe that it is very important. And as a parent, I think about the future. And what we saw as, under the shadow of the Harris government, we are still paying the price for it. It's so much easier to tear something down than it is to build something up. And so fundamentally, I think that if there's a way in which we can look at schools, and conversations are already happening right now about the use of schools as community hubs, which I personally think is amazing. As a Civic Action Diversity Fellow, my group was Public Space and Infrastructure, and we were looking at ways of supporting the Community Hubs initiative. And I do think that we need to have funding to help support that. And so when we look at daycares, when we look at health clinics, when we look at a place where people can come to, that's where I think schools are. They have been built in centrally located places, and we should maintain it so that if it's not being used for a school, what else can it be used for? So I'm 100%, when I talk about creative solutions and ideas, I'm open to this concept of community hubs, and we're seeing that that's a model which a lot of people are thinking about now.
Is the Liberal Party ready to push that model forward further?
Seriously?
Is the party ready to move that model further, to expand on that model?
I'm ready to push that forward. I mean, in terms of my personal advocacy, I think it's really important. And so just as it's important to be listening and thinking about what's being said, we need to act, which is why I think when we have passionate parents who are like, look, we need to do something about this, we do. We can't just sit back and say, okay, that's fine, no problem. We actually have to get up and not just do a Facebook like, and go out there and do something. So I agree, there's more work that needs to be done.
Peter, heritage is a provincial responsibility. Assuming that things remain more or less as they are and that we don't have substantial change on this issue or further change than we've already seen, is it possible or is it desirable to use heritage as a lever to help retain these places as public places, or to retain these buildings, or to change the funding formula? Is there a productive route there that might alter the political calculus and improve the situation?
Well, I certainly think, as I said in my opening remarks, that if we can't preserve the heritage buildings that we own, our chances of preserving privately owned heritage buildings is zero. I don't know if I would say that it's a lever or a button to push. I think we have a responsibility to preserve our heritage, and I think that needs to be reflected in the funding formula. Here in Toronto, we have a very large stock of older buildings, so I think we have a particular responsibility here. If the funding isn't provided for it, then the pressures will be immense to get rid of those buildings. If the province sees it as a priority, then the funding has to be there to make it happen. And I would just add at the same time, we also need to ensure that the funding formula reflects the fact that those buildings will be, in many cases, smaller than the ideal size that the province currently says those buildings should be in terms of the number of students in them. The formula has to recognize that older buildings are going to have a different configuration of students. They have big, wide hallways, which they're currently penalized for. They are going to be more expensive to retrofit for barrier-free access. That's something that has to be recognized. We, at provincial level, have to make sure it's financially viable to preserve those buildings if we're going to say in truth that we want to preserve them.
All right. Well, thank you. Maybe we can wrap it up there and go to the Q&A. And just before we do, one thought that people have questions. If you want to raise your hands, Keegan can perhaps find you with the mic. One thing that I found interesting in researching this issue over the last couple of years is to look at how the numbers stack up. When it comes to selling off public assets, that same property of Bloor-Dufferin is going to generate about $120 million towards the backlog of maintenance at the board. Out of that, the board is going to have to pay for a new school. When all of that's said and done, and that new school is built on a cheap budget by undistinguished architects being paid low fees, by the way, when that's done, taxpayers will wind up with something like $8 million for one of the largest and most valuable sites that the TDSB potentially has to sell off. Steve Shaw, do you have any idea how much your maintenance backlog is increasing every year? You ballpark that? It's about $4 billion right now. So.
I believe it went from 3.7 last year to just over 4 billion this year.
So something like 8 or 10% a year.
Yeah, roughly.
So the sale of a 100-year-old property, which is one of the largest and most valuable pieces of real estate that TDSB owns, selling that is going to eat maybe 1/4 of the increase in the TDSB's maintenance backlog this year. Is that ballpark correct? $80 million versus about $300 million?
Roughly, yes, that's correct.
So it's not even a drop in the bucket. So we're selling century-old public assets, which may or may not be needed now, and it's not even going to begin to cover the increase in the problem that we have. So that, to me, as public policy, makes no sense. Questions? Let's open it up.
Thank you for your comments, and Alex, thank you for your questions. Both of you talked about changing the funding formula. One thing I'd just like you to consider as you contemplate changes is the planet, is the environment. Most of Ontario's landfill apparently is from demolition of buildings. Heritage is good for the environment. So, in that funding formula, start giving credits and incentives for the planet. And you'll be also at the same time giving credits and incentives for heritage.
Useful suggestion. Thank you. Who else? Over here? Lynn over here?
So I loved hearing funding solutions, and Alex, I loved your suggestion yesterday in the piece that you wrote in the Globe about perhaps a new ownership model is needed for these assets that we happen to call schools at any given juncture in time. These assets are not Catholic, they are not French speaking, they are not English speaking, they are simply public assets. And right now they're argued over between not only the 4 competing school boards, but also between multiple levels of government. When a school closure, as you both have pointed out, when a school closure happens, it's being forced upon a school board that feels like they have that as their only bad choice. But then often the city councillor will show up and say, you can't close this school because that's green space for my Toronto citizens. And so then you get conflict in every which way. And so the ownership model that we have isn't working. So while we can talk a lot about funding, and that's a big part of the solution, I also think being open to a new approach to ownership is a key. So I just want to, I had a statement, I got cut short, and I wanted to get this in full disclosure. So I have no question. But I would love to know if you were, on both of you, if you were to look at potential new ownership models, what might that look like for each of you? Because that's a big shift, maybe even bigger than funding.
Well, if you don't mind my diving in my mind, Krista, private ownership would not be part of this. I have no interest in public-private partnerships. I think the public gets shafted with them time after time. But if there's a question of looking at agreements between school boards, cities, and provinces on shared use of property and making a collective public decision, I'm very open to that. I want to make sure, though, that we don't have a situation where local school boards who have paid for those schools over decades, one might even say centuries, don't find themselves getting pushed out of the way by a province that says, well, I'm going to assume ownership of this, I need to liquidate this asset. And in many ways I find that the local leadership is far more attached to preservation of education spaces than you get from, I'll say, a more distant provincial leadership who have very different priorities than looking after local interests.
So, Krista, you and I have talked a little bit about this in terms of what that would look like. And for me, a lot of the decision-making process that I would base this on is looking at the metrics of it and knowing the complication between all the multiple levels of government. So I don't want to say, oh yeah, we'll just do that and it'll be easy peasy. Clearly, this is an issue that has, been going on for years and years and decades because it's complicated. And so I wouldn't rule out working with private companies, but I also think that it's important to say, well, what is the asset, what's the value of it in this situation? And so it's very important, I believe it's very important to be able to be held to account and be responsible, and the government plays a big role in that. But the role of a municipal councillor, the municipality, and the school board are just as important partners in this role. So I think that I haven't had these conversations with the municipality, and I haven't had the conversation with teachers or with TSB or even with parents about what that could look like. And I think that's why I'm saying, I think it's important to listen to what other ideas there are out there.
Well, if I could float one, we've heard some mention of or a suggestion of trying to alter funding so that you deal with sustainability in some way. So that might open up different pots of money. That's a broad theme that the federal government is interested in. One wonders if there might not be some way to make a connection there. Also, the community hubs model has not been really well understood, and it hasn't really been spun out yet, but clearly there is an interest on the part of the Premier and part of the Ministry of Education to start thinking about these issues and thinking about public assets in a holistic way with that. Is it possible to, can you make a commitment, or can you suggest how that model might be expanded to be more effective and to try and address the scale of the problem we're talking about here?
Vote for me? No, I'm just kidding. Actually, what you're saying with regards to community hubs, truly, is the fact that I've recognized that we need to have funding for community hubs, because a lot of the community leaders that I have seen who are like, we need to advocate, to use this space, are doing it inside of their desk. It's not a full-time job because people are volunteering their hours, and we know what that labor looks like, where you're not going to be able to do it. You have to pay, to have a roof over your head and all of those things. And I want to say that when it comes down to something that's sustainable, we do have to put money to help support that, and we have to say, we need a voice that is consistent and that can be held accountable.
Well, what about changing policies? There is the regulation through which, I forget the number, but the regulation through which school boards have to, unload surplus property that gets offered to public agencies, but it gets offered through this formal process. It's not easy through that process for a group of smaller nonprofits to get together and put together a partnership. A nonprofit developer can't come and say, we can take over this land. They don't, why not simply change the procedure through which that work is done to allow for different other options within the nonprofit or the public sector?
Sorry, when you hear something about the nonprofits coming in, these people are at some of the tables that are doing community hubs.
Right, but I guess what I'm sure I get. So the process through which school boards have to offer surplus land is very specific, right? It goes to provincial agencies, it goes to other school boards, then it goes to the city. Well, what if that process was altered to allow for coalitions, partnerships, other or arrangements between nonprofit and potentially even nonprofit with for-profit groups that would serve the public interest? You know, is there a way just through altering that procedure to allow for other options without necessarily changing the whole approach wholesale?
I know that it was recently amended to be a bit more exhaustive, and I think more work can be done on that. And I think that's not something that I can just say, oh yeah, sure, I'll do that, without understanding what the impacts are on all the different potential stakeholders. But I would certainly welcome it.
More questions from the floor? Jeff Catella? Oh, sorry. Please, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Richard Morehouse. I'm on the board of Heritage Toronto, and we're undertaking a State of Heritage in Toronto report, and schools will certainly be featured in it, so this symposium is very, very timely. I had a question to Lee, and Peter might want to comment as well. Lee, you mentioned quite rightly that municipalities can designate heritage properties. They're empowered to do so. But the Ontario Heritage Act also allows the province to designate. And I wondered what you thought about the province taking a leadership role and looking at the designation of some of those important heritage schools across the province and indicating how important historic schools are in our education system.
Thank you. I think that's a really good question. And yes, the province does hold the Act, the Heritage Act, and has recognized as well that municipal leaders and communities are active players and very engaged locally. Has that actually been done? I think we can certainly talk about that. I mean, we have the power to actually do that, but I think we're just mindful also of the democratic process. That if the advice that is coming through to say, you know, this is, you know, the municipal council who's been very active and very engaged with their constituents are saying, this is what we think and this is what the experts say. Maybe we have to escalate that to bring greater weight on who is saying what. But I don't want to undermine the democratic process of that, because I think we might get into some issues of being seen as parenting that process.
And if I could speak to that as well. Again, my inclination is to leave as much in local hands as possible when it comes to this, because I think local communities are more responsive and often have a greater sense of the local value. But I don't see any reason why the province would not act on an exceptional basis when there have been some kind of breakdown in the process. I think it's a reasonable question on your part, and I think it would be a reasonable action on the part of the province to look at these issues on a far more substantial basis than they have in the past.
Good. Who's got the mic? Carol Kleinfeld?
Thank you. I think when we're talking about partnerships, I'm going to ask you whether or not Infrastructure Ontario, along with the P3 process, which is very poorly understood clearly, because it's not a question of handing over public assets to private companies. That's an incorrect idea. So I'm wondering why Infrastructure Ontario is not brought in, given that they do all of the other provincially held properties across Ontario.
Sorry, before you give the mic away, I didn't quite understand your question. Why is Infrastructure Ontario not taking over the ownership and management of these properties?
No, I didn't say that. I was asking if Infrastructure Ontario has been asked their opinion, or if they have entered the conversation about partnerships for public schools in Ontario. They deal with courthouses, hospitals, prison, every other type of public building. So why have they not been brought in for the schools?
So you're saying through the process, why have they not been involved in the process of the dispersal of public assets when schools are being offloaded?
Yeah.
Well,
and the management of.
From the examples that you gave, if you're talking about courthouses, you're talking about assets that are owned by the province of Ontario right now. schools are not owned by the province of Ontario. They're owned by the school boards. The people in Toronto paid to build these schools out of their property taxes. They own them, and they need to retain control of them. I'll just say as well, well, I would say what's been out of control is provincial government not providing the funding to the school, the education system, the way it needs to be funded. And that's the reason we're looking at a huge backlog. Well, I think if you want to preserve public and local control of school boards, bringing in IO changes that power dynamic dramatically. I don't think that's to our advantage. If the province was actually running the schools, we'd see an awful lot more schools being demolished. I'll tell you, ministers of education are very clear on this. You can't afford to run your schools, you don't have money for backlog, sell off a bunch of buildings and use the money to fix up the remainder. That's the whole thrust of them. If you're going to protect local buildings, local schools, if you're going to protect Toronto's heritage, Toronto has to be front and center. Well, I'll just say, there may be a different thrust in this conversation, that P3s are a financial failure, that the Economist in Britain has looked at the impact of P3s on rail and healthcare, and they have cost an incredible amount of money. The Auditor General of Ontario has pointed out the many billions of dollars we've lost because of P3 operations. It's a dead end for us.
All right, so let's move on. I think maybe Carol's suggestion might be framed as figuring out how to use other bodies that have expertise in dealing with real estate or finding arrangements around facilities to come up with different models. Yeah, do you want to take that? Please. Okay, quickly.
Carol, I just want to address one of the things that you were saying about how everything sounds like doom and gloom. Like the TDSB has, been allocated $841 million to help fix the schools, and I know that TDSB has said we've only been able to spend 40% of it. So, and the issue there is also when are kids in school, right? Do you actually want to be, tearing things down and doing it when the environmental conditions could potentially impact them? And so they have to fix the schools in a finite period of time in the summer months. And so that concentration repair could impact like how many people can actually show up, how many, the employment and labor that's available and increased costs and that sort of thing. And we have to look at what can we do to help ensure that it's more stable and that it's more sustainable over time. So there are things that are in place. It's not totally doom and gloom. Since last year, since 2015, we have allocated $1.4 billion to help fix schools. It's going to take time. Like these things have, built up over time, and it will still take time to continue. And I have to say, from inheriting this, the reality that we face is potentially a province that's going to be not talking about allocating money to fix schools over 10 years. It's going to be cuts, cuts, cuts. So that's the reality that we have to look at as well.
All right, one more question.
Okay.
I think Jeff Patel with the stripes had his.
Thank you. I'm just going to pick up on Krista's going back to the battle days of Mike Harris 20 years ago. I seem to recall one of the things that he did, which was pretty fundamental, was to take away the taxing ability from school boards. Municipalities still have it, but the school boards are left in a situation where anything they want to do, they have to go cap in hand to the province. So in line with Peter's comments about it's better to have things local, I'm wondering, what you feel, members of the panel, would be, is this something we should be looking at again, restoring the taxing ability of the local school boards? And how would that impact on what we're talking about today?
If you don't mind my jumping in first, Jeff, I think it's a good question. That's something that we would have to think about for a while because of the different implications. I don't think it's one that should be rejected, but I think it's one that people would have to think through. In the interim, however, I think the school boards have been put in impossible positions. I look at trustees whose support staff have been cut dramatically, so their ability to respond to constituents has been cut back. We went through this with the TDSB in 2014. The Liberal Minister of Education recognized there had been dysfunction on the TDSB, didn't recognize that most of the dysfunctional trustees had been de-elected in the fall of 2014, and put tremendous restrictions on the school board. My experience with trustees in the past is they are tremendous advocates for schools, for kids, for parents, and hamstringing them is a huge problem. The change in boundaries for school boards that's going to come up with this next election is going to mean that trustees are stretched over bigger territories than they have in the past, and their ability to respond is going to be undermined. So I think the first thing to do is restore the ability of trustees to have adequate administrative support so that they can deal with the issues at hand. And I think we need to look at the Education Act so that we have an adequate number of trustees so they can do the job in terms of interacting with people and representing for their communities that they currently, in my opinion, now can't do.
Okay. Do we have time for one more question? Quickly.
Okay, so Stephen Seaborn from Campaign for Public Education. My grandparents in the 30s helped to build the schools that are being shown up here. My parents as well. I'm now helping maintain through my taxes. So I'd like to get to the root of the problem, which is I understand our government doesn't have enough money. So you've got to choose between healthcare, between this and that. So to the root of the problem, what are the revenue tools that we can find that used to exist when my grandparents were helping to build the schools? One you mentioned over here. The other is that when both my parents and grandparents were paying for the schools, 50% of our taxes came from corporations. Now we have a 12% tax rate in Ontario, which is like the lowest in North America. So when are the policymakers going to look for more revenue tools so we're not scrapping over the remains to try and keep our schools standing and conserved? That's my simple little question.
Nice way to close. Lee, Peter?
Well, I'm happy to address that. I can't give you exact figures now, but we've already set out the principles for our platform that we will be looking at tax increases for corporations and for the wealthiest individuals in this society. We opposed the corporate tax cuts that were brought forward by the Liberals a number of years ago because we knew that they would make a very difficult situation even worse. You in this room are well aware of the difficulties we have funding public education properly. We propose to change that. And we also propose to not go forward with further privatizations and to recover some of our lost public assets so that we can recover the funding that we need to run this society.
I'm really glad that you brought up that Toronto Star article because when I read it, I was not surprised by it because there's clearly a disparity in what's happening. And so I think that there is a serious issue that we have at hand because a lot of people are like, yeah, we need to do more for this. But then when you ask them to say, hey, can you pay more for it? People are like, oh, no, I got to do this and I got to do that. And we need to make sure that as a collective whole that we are voicing our desire for where we spend our money. And I think we cannot rest saying, we can do that through our votes. And we know that the looming reality is having more cuts, which will further impact already the damage that has been done. So I advocate to everyone to think very carefully about what that looks like and how we can make a difference because we see what has happened, when we had a government that was nothing but cuts, and we need to kind of find a remedy to make sure that we are investing in our future, that we are actually thinking about the children of tomorrow because we know what it takes to build coming up to, striking, breaking ground, that is only the beginning of maybe 5-10-year project. And so we have to have that forward thinking and start planning from today. So we have started investing money into fixing our schools. We need time to continue building on that, and we need to continue our advocacy. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Well, I'll have to leave it there. Kathy?
Thank you, Alex and Lee and Peter, for such insight, and particularly to Lee and Peter for taking time from what would be otherwise out banging on doors, talking to voters. So thank you so much. We're in an election year, and it's a great, thank you for being here.